All right. Wow. Okay. You are so compliant. Amazing.
Look at that.
I think we're waiting for a live stream to start, so I'll wait to actually welcome. But I guess maybe I'll ask over here because maybe a few more people might come in. If you feel comfortable and you're on the end, if you feel comfortable sliding in a little bit to make a spot, that would be great. If you have to rush out, then don't. Oh, thank you so much. Great. We'll just make it so that if people are coming in, they can get to a seat and not have to step on your lap. Excellent. All right, we good to go? Great. Do you want to say anything? Please.
Thank you all for coming out tonight despite the rain. We're so happy to see all of you. So we have Nina Simon, author of Mother-Daughter Murder Night. Welcome back. And Nita Prose, author of The Maid and now The Mystery Guest. So congratulations, Nita.
Thank you.
So we're going to have a discussion between the two of them, followed by audience Q&A if you all have any questions, and then a book signing. So whenever you two are ready.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. We're really looking forward to having a conversation, opening it up to your questions, and then, of course, Nita is here to sign books. She came all the way from Canada, so I think that it would really be meaningful for all of the books to get signed so that everybody can go home with a terrific signed book by this incredible author, and she can go back to Canada and not feel like the books need to follow her to another country. I got to tell you that I came down today from Santa Cruz, California. I actually had to chainsaw my way down the road to get to the airport, and it was worth it because as soon as the folks from Zibby's contacted me and asked if I would be in conversation with Nita Prose, I instantly said yes. I didn't even know if I had childcare. I didn't know, I consult my mother if she could house me. I just knew that the opportunity to be in conversation with such an incredible author who is the creator of such an incredible character in Molly the Maid was just a real pleasure. So thank you for allowing me to have this conversation with you. And we're all in for a real treat in getting to talk with Nita tonight.
Well, thank you for chainsawing your way out of the jungle in order to be here.
Yeah, that'll be our next murder mystery. So the mystery guest, which we're here to talk about tonight, this beautiful book that I'm not going to knock over, is the sequel to The Maid, which was a #1 New York Times bestseller. It was a bestseller in pretty much every country you can think of. It won so many awards in both crime fiction and as a debut novel that I assume that most people here have read it. Maybe you own several copies, but I'm just curious from raise of hands, who here has read The Maid? Okay, great. So many people here know Molly, and I'm sure are excited to now be back with Molly the Maid in The Mystery Guest, which is the sequel to this book. It's an incredible book that fortunately came out in the fall, so at least I got a chance to read it. Who here has read The Mystery Guest? Okay,
oh, bless
excellent.
your heart.
Okay. Now, those of you who raised your hands, we're not going to share any spoilers now, but if when you're talking to Nita later, if you have any opinions, you want to talk about the murderer, please feel free to have that conversation, but we want to keep it spoiler-free for those who haven't had a chance to read The Mystery Guest yet, which I believe just came out in the UK this week. Is that right?
Yeah, it came out just a couple of days ago in the UK.
Yeah. So, Molly the Maid is back. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit for those who haven't heard about The Maid, who haven't read that incredible bestseller, about Molly the Maid and about what's happening with her in The Mystery Guest.
Sure. So in The Maid, Molly is, of course, a hotel maid. She works at the Regency Grand, which is a 5-star boutique hotel. And one day she opens up a room, she's going to clean it. And of course, there's somebody dead in bed, very dead, as she would say in bed. Now, Molly's a bit unusual. She struggles with social cues. You know, she has trouble communicating sometimes and communicates in a way that might seem a little bit awkward or different. And she grows through the course of a week where she becomes the main suspect of a murder in The Maid. She grows exponentially and just discovers a way to communicate both who she is and who she wants to be. So she goes from really living a life of extraordinary invisibility to being incredibly visible and having to navigate that and figuring out how to do that and still be herself. And in the second book, we have another Molly adventure that takes place in the Regency Grand Hotel when a world-renowned reclusive writer drops dead, very dead, on the tea room floor at the Regency Grand Hotel. And yet again, Molly finds herself in the middle of a mystery that she has to solve. And she must solve it very quickly because she doesn't want fingers pointing her way yet again. So on the surface, I think these are murder mysteries, but there's a lot more going on. I think of them as really voice-driven, character-driven novels where you as readers get to step behind the eyes of a character and become her, live for a little while as her. My hope is, if I've done things right, that to live as her is to love her.
Well, I think a lot of us fell in love with Molly and her quirkiness, her prickliness, but also just the fact that she's a character you want to root for and you want her to grow and to win. And one of the things I was really struck by in The Mystery Guest is that it's not a sequel that takes place the day after the end of the first book. It takes place a couple years later, and she's really grown. And I guess I'm curious about how you thought about what ways you wanted to have Molly show up differently in this book, and in what ways you felt like this is the Molly who people also saw in The Maid.
So the Molly in the first book is a woman who is struggling with grief. She's lost her grandmother, and her grandmother really oriented her in the world. She taught her how to be and how to be as a social human being. And without Gran, she's really oh so very lost. And so for the very first time, she has to navigate the world without those eyes behind her looking after her. And in the second book, she's actually grown quite a bit, as you say. And now I think, as in life, when we know ourselves better, we no longer have to concentrate so hard on who we are. We have some room and some energy to devote to other people, to exploring who those we love around us are and how they have come to be. And so in the second novel, I think Molly is really not looking so much inward to try and discover who she is, but she's looking back at her past, trying to understand how her grandmother raised her into being the woman she is today.
And, you know, Gran is a character who I love so deeply. And I actually had to remind myself when reading The Mystery Guest that Gran is actually not alive. This is not a spoiler, but she's not alive in either of the books. And yet she's so present. I see a lot of people nodding because she's just this bedrock of support and love for Molly. And, you know, I think that when somebody dies in our life, we'll say, oh, their memory will always be with us. But that can be kind of trite sometimes. And I was reflecting that I think you really dealt with that concept in a very layered and deep way in these books. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that choice to make this character who's really in some ways the sidekick or the most important relationship with the main character, somebody who's not present in the current timeline of the books.
Yeah, I think for me, it's really fun to write a mystery. And the great gift of writing a mystery is that there's an engine attached. And it's a very powerful engine that moves you from the beginning to the end because there's one central question. What's the question we're asking? That's it. It's like you knew. We know what the plot is, right? But for me, the interesting part was to layer on top of that something else. And the notion of grief is a really fascinating concept to me. And something that I personally understand or am fascinated with is how sometimes when someone dies, they can become more present in their absence than when they were alive. And that's something I experienced very powerfully through my mother, who died about 8 years ago. And she was a force of nature, not unlike Gran, a little bit different in some ways, but fundamentally the same. She cared for other people with such depth, and her family meant everything to her. There's nothing she wouldn't do for us. And when she was gone, I heard her more clearly than I ever heard her when she was alive. I hear her all the time. Whenever I have a conundrum or I have like a moral issue or I don't know what way I'm going, I'm telling you, I hear her voice with such certitude telling me something. And it's as though in her absence, I have created a synthesis, a distillation of her that acts as my guide more powerfully now that she doesn't exist than she did in real life. And that is something I wanted to explore and investigate through Gran and Molly.
Did you, that's a beautiful encapsulation about your experience with your own mother. Why is it a gran instead of a mom?
Because I wanted Molly to be out of place with her times. I wanted her to be so separate, not only because, socially she's a bit different, but to be out of step with anybody who she might come across who's a peer. And that was an extra layer of difficulty she would have to navigate in her life.
Well, and that really makes me think about how in The Mystery Guest, you're also working with different timelines, literally within Molly's own life, but also the contemporary storyline and mystery is really deeply informed by what's happened in the past. And I guess I'm curious, from a craft perspective, was that something that felt like you knew that was going to be critical to writing this story? Was it a challenge you were curious to try? I mean, for me as a writer, it seems incredibly challenging to imagine writing a dual timeline book and ensuring that readers are going to feel as invested in one timeline as they will in the other.
Yeah, well, there was a challenge, and it kind of went like this. I wrote the first book. It was really successful. People wanted more. And my publishers very early on, after three months, maybe 4 months, were like, can you write another one? Well, I never planned this as a series. So I really had to ask myself, what else is there? What else? Where can this character go? What else is there to say? And I realized that the past was where there was a whole other life that would explain the present. But it was really only, kind of an accident that I figured out how to do the past and present back and forth. And it happened while I was on tour with a maid. And I was in England at this tiny little museum outside of Sussex. And I stumbled across a display case. And in the display case, this is really going somewhere, I promise you.
No, it is.
Was the mummified body of a rat and a single silver spoon. And I'm looking at this like, what the hell is this doing in this museum? And there was a little write-up underneath. And as it turns out, this was a memorial to a servant who had once in the 17th century worked in this castle. And she worked as a maid. And she was unceremoniously dismissed from her job after being accused of stealing a piece of silverware. And she fought it. She said she didn't do it. Didn't matter. She was frog-marched out the door. And then many years later, when the builders were excavating the castle and trying to restore it, they came across the mummified body of a rat and this single silver spoon. And for me, it's a true story. It exists. If you go to the town of Lewes, which is outside of Brighton, and you go to the Castle Museum there, you will see a display case on the second floor where there's this mummified rat and this spoon. And it's in dedication to this lowly maid who was wrongly accused of stealing a piece of silver. And for some reason, that little tidbit of reality, that true to life story, was a cautionary tale, and it was a parable all rolled in one. Be careful what you assume. Nothing is ever as it seems. And most important to the mystery writer, the truth will never stay buried forever. And all of these sort of forces came to life in me right at the time I was thinking about what do I do next. And then I realized that the past was so fertile and that this novel would really explain all of the sacrifice that Gran made in order for Molly to grow and thrive, because she doesn't have a special education in any way. And yet her Gran gave her so many advantages.
Yeah. Well, and, those who've read the book know that that mummified rat is in the book. And even as you're telling it, it sounds like a fairy tale or a fable. And exactly. I think that one of the things I'm so impressed that you did with each of these books was kind of cross genres, right? The first book, I've heard you speak about it as murder mystery and feel-good fiction. And actually, that's how I first learned about the book, because I'd written this book that was sort of a sweet family drama and a murder mystery. And I was very nervous about, could it be sold? How would this work? And then I heard an interview with you talking about The Maid, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is what I'm trying to do. And this person has done it so brilliantly. And then when I read The Mystery Guest, you did it in a different way that incorporates some of these, maybe not fairy tale, but almost like Gothic fable elements.
They are fairy tales. Yes. What I want to do is write fairy tales for adults. I don't want to give them up. It's really selfish. So that is exactly what I'm trying to do. And I do think, I mean, you and I have, think that similarity in both of our books of being drawn to cross-pollinate novels, to find a mix. I call them Frankenstein books, you know, borrowing from one genre and another and trying to find the symmetry between the two to make something new and a little bit different.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, but, you know, as you know, creating a monster
exactly, that's the problem.
Is not easy. And I certainly found, you know, whether it's about pacing or about interesting people in different parts of the story, what do you find when you're working in that cross-pollination? What do you feel is the most interesting challenge that you have to work with to be able to make both work well or satisfying?
For me and what I do, it is respecting the norms of the genre without breaking people's hearts. So, for instance, there are some readers who expect that when they enter my books, that they will be entering a police procedural. And that is not the world that I create.
Yeah.
I create a hyper reality that exists outside of time and place. I never name a place.
Right.
We don't know where we are, never say what city we're in. There are contradictory clues. We might be in Britain, but there's dollars and there's the Olive Garden. Who knows where we are?
I really thought we were in London, by the way. I was shocked earlier tonight to learn that was, this is a brilliant sleight of hand by you. Yeah.
So, you know, there are some readers who expect reality. They want Lee Child. They want, you know, James Patterson. And what I always say to them is, go read them.
I don't think Jack Reacher lives in reality. I think he's in a different reality.
He's in a different sort of reality.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me, I wanted to do something that was a little bit hyper real, a little closer to Wes Anderson, but to have emotional truth be reign supreme, and for that to be absolutely true, even if we lived in a hyper real sort of setting.
When we talk about genre expectations and police procedurals, you know, Molly is not a cop, although she has excellent investigatory skills because of her attention to detail. And in The Maid, you use a pretty classic amateur sleuth setup with the stakes, which is that she is the primary suspect. And actually, there is a cascade of evidence suggesting that she might have killed this person. And in The Mystery Guest, you had to kind of reinvent how you were going to have stakes for this main character, because you can't make her the primary suspect every time. So I'm curious how you thought about stakes while maintaining an amateur sleuth as your lead with the second book.
The key to that was, for me, growth. That she was bigger and bolder this time, and that she could actually move towards sleuthing instead of being a suspect. And that her unusual perspective, her ability to see things we would never see, would be the key to solving that mystery. You know, that her difference with the first book and the second actually turns out to be the greatest strength.
Yeah. Well, and you know, it's incredible listening to you talk about this, because I don't know how many of you know this, but Nita is not only an incredible storyteller in her own right, but for years was a really powerhouse editor at Penguin Random House, at Simon & Schuster. And I'm so curious, based on your editorial work, you know, you've worked with authors, incredible fiction authors, incredible mystery and crime authors for a long time. I'm curious if there's a way that you feel like, I mean, I'm sure there's a million ways your editorial experience informs your writing, but is there a way you feel like, here's something I see that informs or leads me to approach this differently than I might have if I wasn't having all this built up experience as an editor?
When I write, I feel like there's a little mini me sitting on my shoulder and it's telling me, don't do that. If you do that, you're going to, you know, end up in a corner and you're going to write yourself to nowhere. And there's just a shorthand I know about how narrative works that I owe to all of the writers that I worked with for 20 years. You know, I grew on the backs of their creation, and helping them through is like the best master's course in writing I could ever have dreamed of. And I'm hugely grateful to them.
Is there anything you feel like you have to forget about being an editor?
The industry?
To be, okay.
I know too much. I know too much.
Well, and editors these days, you know, of course, we, or people like me think about, an editor is just somebody who's sitting there with the manuscript, lovingly working through the text. But of course, editors are project managers, they are business managers, and you know so much more than most authors know. And yet I imagine there were some things still that surprised you in shifting seats to the author side.
Yeah. So the biggest surprise to me was the blindness of being a writer. You know, when I've always described what it feels like to be an editor from that point of view, and I describe it in terms of a labyrinth. So, you know, there's a labyrinth of story, and the writer stands in front of that labyrinth, and they have to, you know, go in there and make their way through the path of story and get out the other side. That's their job as a writer. And as an editor, I would sit on a nice big ladder outside, climb up top, look down and say, if you go that way, you're going to end up nowhere. You're going to be at a dead end. Don't write that way, write over here, and you will make it out the other end. I gave up my ladder. When I became a writer, I didn't have that to stand on anymore. Suddenly I was faced with that maze in front of me and no, like, you know, overall 360 perspective vision. And it was so daunting, and it remains daunting to this day. I think writing takes incredible courage because of that blindness.
Yeah.
You really have to go in knowing so little and having so much trust in your instinct and your, you know, sort of visceral knowledge of story. And as an editor, I never feel that. I'm like, I know what to do. I wouldn't have acquired this if I didn't know how to help you. I feel cocky about it. And I feel so humble as a writer all the time. And every time I don't, oh, wait for it. It's like a lightning bolt will strike me down, and I'll be back at the beginning of that maze. Like, you know, new again. Every time I feel like a newborn baby.
Well, and it strikes me too that as an editor, you were acquiring books for which you knew where the ladder was, and you knew you could see into that maze. And there probably were books that you could look at
I'm not
and say,
the writer.
there's a thicket.
Exactly.
I can't get up there.
I don't know how to do this one. This one isn't for me. Somebody else will figure it out. And then I will be horrifically jealous when they make it a huge success.
And as a writer, do you feel that way, that there are some hedges that look impenetrable, but you want to figure out, how could I write?
It's all hedges.
Genre? Yeah, it's all hedges.
It's all hedges all the time. That's the problem with being a writer, is that and that's why it takes so much courage, because there isn't a path. You don't even know where the path is. And however, it is extremely, as we talked about earlier, it's extremely addictive when you figure it out.
Sure.
You know?
And when you feel you have a surfeit of courage, what do you turn to keep figuring it out?
Writers.
Yeah.
I read. And that is my advice to all writers as well. And those who want to become writers, is to read. And not only read for pleasure. I mean, I love to read to be entertained, but to reread and understand the construction of how characters work, how narrative works, how a scene flows from one to the next, where your attention is drawn to, where it wanes. All of those are lessons that any reader can take simply by actively reading. You can learn how to be a writer.
Well, and that really speaks to my experience, because I studied engineering. You know, I was self-taught, and what I would do was take favorite books off the shelf, and I would just highlight, how did they do this? How did they build tension here?
Yeah. How do you move through time?
Exactly.
Time is one of the very, very difficult things to master as a writer.
And I mean, obviously time plays a big role in the mystery guest, because you're going back and forth. Did you do it on feel, in terms of having a sense of, here's when I need to go back and here's when I need to come forward? Or did you have some kind of architecting concept about how you were going to work with time in a dual timeline book?
I mean, the archetype is really a graph. I mean, when you
I'm an engineer. I love a graph.
You're gonna love this. She's gonna love this. You know, when you're working in the present tense in any narrative, there's a reason to go back to the past. It's because you can't move forward in the present any longer. You have to go back to the past to find something, to quest it, to move back to the present, so then you can keep moving forward. When you're dealing with present and past in that sort of narrative, that is a very common structure. That's why the past exists, so that you can gain something there that moves you back to the present.
Are there scenes you wrote for this book that from the past that did not move you, and so they're still on the cutting room floor?
Oh, there are always scenes like that. But I always think that, you know, 10% of what, well, 90% I hold as a writer, and you get 10%. There's so much more that I know about the characters, the world, the extra scenes that you don't need to see. And that is to buy believability. If I've done my work to believe in the character, the milieu, the narrative, the time, the place, if I've done it, then the 10% I put on the page, hopefully, if I've done my job right, will earn your belief in what I've done. And I think that's true for most writers.
Mm.
We do an extraordinary amount of stuff off the page to earn what we put on the page.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I'm going to ask you one more question, but I'm going to let people know that we're going to open it up to your questions so you can, especially if you're bored by my question, you can start thinking about what yours is. So one of the things I really admire about these books is that the main characters are workers, and mostly unseen workers. You know, we have maids, we have kitchen staff, we have valets, and workbooks can be tricky, right? You know, not everybody wants to read about people at work, and I'm just curious what drew you to these characters, and what made you want to make them the heroes of these stories?
I just think there are so many people in our midst who toil invisibly, you know, and it's so easy to not pay them any mind.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really important for me to find a way to honor that through one character, and to give her a job that she did so thoroughly and enjoyed so very much and was excellent at.
Yeah.
Even though she's, you know, she's never gonna be a doctor or a lawyer or all those professions that we idolize.
Yeah.
But there's a reason to idolize somebody like a maid,
Mm-hmm.
simply for doing such a good job of that. You know, and I think that comes from my upbringing.
Yeah.
I grew up in a very working class home. My parents had to work so hard to become working class. My mother grew up very, very poor in northern Quebec in Canada. You know, she didn't have phone, running water, electricity until she was in her 20s. So, you know, it was she had to work very hard. She did become a nurse. And to make that transition, to know what my parents did in order to give me the life that I now enjoy, I will always owe a debt of gratitude, and will always have a very special understanding for the invisible.
Nice.
Yeah.
Ooh, I don't know what just happened.
I don't know, but
phone really
obviously they liked my answer.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I think that gratitude really comes through in this book, just in terms of the dignity and the honor that you pay, but also the way these characters show up in the story and for each other. And so I just feel really grateful to you for doing that.
Thank you so much.
Well, let's open it up to questions that people might have, and please, you know, let's not talk about who the murderer is, but anything else.
It wasn't me.
Yeah, please.
Oh, I was going to say, I thoroughly enjoyed both books. I read them both twice.
Oh my
I
goodness.
recommended them both to my book group that we have in book group. So thank you so much for that. And I just have, I guess, two questions. I wanted to know how you came up with the title of the mystery guest, and also if it was a conscious choice to not label Molly as a neurodivergent or, you know,
Yeah,
what your thoughts
no,
on
excellent
that.
question. So
And why don't you repeat the question a little bit too? For the
sure.
live
So
stream?
the
Yeah.
first question was the title. You know, was it always titled this, and did I come up with this title? I did not. It was not my title. The original title was The Maid, the Rat, and the Spoon. And it was felt by the powers that be that rat might scare readers away, which I can actually understand, because rats. So yeah, it was actually a suggestion by my UK editor, and I loved it the second she mentioned it, and we decided that we would go with that as a title. And the second question, and it's a very good question, is was it a decision not to label Molly in any way? I never label her as neurodivergent. I never say anything about why she might struggle so much with social cues. And yes, that was very conscious. Many years ago, I worked with special needs kids, and it was a formative, incredible time. And of course, all of these kids had labels in the classroom. They were very important labels for us as teachers, as instructors, to know how to educate them, know how to treat them well, and know how to dictate lessons that might actually move them. But something that I noticed was when we used to take these kids out on a field trip, and by field trip, I mean that we'd go to museums, but sometimes we would just go out into the world. We'd go to the donut shop across the street, and it wasn't to educate the students. It was to educate everybody else. Because these kids might have tics, they might be slightly different in certain obvious ways that you would notice. And most people treated them with great dignity, except for the people who didn't. And it was remarkable to see grown adults treating children, adolescence with such cruelty. And it struck me how these kids would rise above that every time. They would demonstrate so much dignity in the face of abject, extreme prejudice. And something about that stuck with me. And so when I was writing Molly, I didn't realize it at the time, but I gave all of the very best qualities of those students that I taught, I gave them all to her.
Mhm.
And I wanted to give her that dignity and strength and pride in who she was and in the work that she did. And I didn't want to label her because I felt that as soon as I said on the cover copy or somewhere else in the book, you know, she is X or she is Y, that a segment of readership, just like those certain people in those coffee shops, would say, this is not me, this is other, this is different, I'm not interested. What I wanted you to do, as I said before, was to step into her experience, to become Molly, to live as her for a minute and experience what life might be like with a different makeup of your brain. And to experience that would be to come to have compassion for it. And I don't believe that anybody is a label. You know, as important as those labels are, I'm not going to diminish how important they are in an educated setting. But I didn't want her only to be a label. I wanted her to be a fulsome, complete, multifaceted personality, the same way every one of us is. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that you read a lot. So obviously you read to prepare yourself to write a new book. You read for pleasure. So in a given week, like, how much time would you spend working and how much time would you spend reading in terms of organizing your life for your work as an author?
You know, I read maybe 3 books a week now, which is actually down from 5 to 10. Because remember, I was an editor, so I read manuscripts constantly, right? That was just part of the job. And believe me, you get very fast after a while. So yeah, I would say I read 3 books a week now. And I read them with great joy and relish because they're not manuscripts, they're completed. Oh, the joy of reading a complete book. Oh, and I think I work 3 or 4 hours a day on writing, and then I do another stint, maybe 1-2 hours more. So maybe 6 hours a day. Yeah.
And secondly, when you are developing your book, how do you go about doing that? Do you like make an outline, or do you like write vignettes and then see how they all fit together? What's your work style?
Yeah, it's a bit of an ugly mess. And for me, the happy point is the knowing and not knowing. So what I mean by that is I need to know a few stepping stones, moments that are going to happen way ahead in the journey that I'm going to land. I don't know the trajectory to get there, but if I had to write that scene right now at the beginning of a process, I could write it instantly. It's just that I don't know how to get there. And that knowing and the not knowing is like the divine perfect for me as a writer. It's the place where I can discover in the moment, and where there's fire and magic on the page, you know, and yet I feel some gravitas, some strength about knowing where I'm going. So it's a matter of knowing and not knowing for me.
I don't know about for you, but it's one of my favorite things about genre writing is that when you're writing a mystery, you know that there needs to be a dead body somewhere in the first 50 pages.
Rules.
And and that can kind of create these tent poles that you know you're moving towards, and harder to get lost in the maze to some extent, although there are plenty of little turns in there.
Is it the same for you, that you have some sense of where you're going and then there's some gray zone?
Yes, but I think that because you're continuing to enrich and develop a world, and I wrote one book, now I'm writing in a very different world, and so I also spend some time in the beginning getting to know characters and seeing if there's juice with them, because I feel like I have to write those scenes kind of outside of anything that's about outlining or where the book goes, just to see, does this feel like it's jumping off the page, or does it feel kind of mechanical? And there is, in writing, people talk about plotters versus pantsers, where the idea is there are some people who plot everything out and have a 10-page outline ahead, and some people write from the seat of their pants, although I've never met a writer who's truly 100% one or the other. Although
I
I guess
have.
you've worked with so many as an editor. Yeah.
They
yeah.
scare the bejesus out of me.
The plotters, you mean? Or
No, the
the
opposite.
pantsers.
The pantsers. Lisa Jewell. Okay, Liz Nugent. They will Lisa
Wow, with
will
those
sit
big
down and
twists.
go, I don't know anything about this book. I just know the first sentence, and I just sit down, and when it gets boring, I make something happen. Oh my God, that is terrifying to me. But that is a writer who's written 20 books.
Sure.
Okay, it's in her DNA.
Yeah.
She doesn't have to think hard about it because she's so skilled.
Mm.
And she knows her genre and her characters so well that
Yeah.
she has such trust and confidence that she can just sit there and let it happen, and it will.
Yeah.
And she'll know if
absolutely.
it doesn't. She'll know enough to stop and then fix it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I feel like there was a question over here. Yeah.
No, it's been answered.
Oh, good. Okay, excellent. Asked and answered. Okay,
Good.
let's come over here. Yes.
Just like you, I guess you said you kept the location a little bit vague, but I think when I read the back and it said you lived in Toronto, I just said, okay, this has got to be Toronto. But
I love it.
did you also try to keep an original made, especially at the beginning of the story? It wasn't entirely clear like what time period it was until much later when I think the Olive Garden came up, because there's a little old-fashioned elements like she curtsies. And
Yes.
she has a traditional maid outfit, which you wouldn't see too often. So did you do that on purpose, trying to keep the time period a little bit vague, at least at first?
I wanted as many vagaries as possible because something important for me was reader participation. I love books where the author starts and the reader finishes. So one of my favorite things is when readers like you will come up to me and say, that was London, right? Or that was New York. And every time you tell me that, I say, yes, you're right. It was Boston. Absolutely, it was Boston. It was New Hampshire. Of course it was. I will say yes to anything because it is a compliment to me that you even had the audacity to go in and complete my picture. I don't think of myself as a solo creator. I write the book, I put it out there, and then your job is to finish it. You know, when you pick it up and start reading, you complete the picture for me. You decide where it's set. You decide who these characters are, what they mean to you, how specific they are to you, if they're like family or somebody you know. And that means that I am so complimented by that because it means you've taken up the creative process and you've finished the book for me. So thank you for being readers. I can't do what I do unless you do what you do. And together, we are co-creators.
Well, it really speaks to your power as a storyteller that I think that any of us reading this book, the sharp specifics are there that buy us so fully into the world that we do go there without any dissonance about, wait, what city am I in? There's just a sense of I am in Molly's world. I'm in the Regency Hotel and I'm placing it, and connecting those dots in a way that works for me as a reader. And I think it's probably very challenging to both get us so deeply immersed and keep open that place for participation. So I'm really impressed by that. I feel like there was a question over here.
I'm just curious, having been an editor in the business so well, what parameters did you use to choose your own editor? When you got feedback from the editor?
Good question.
What did you?
Was I terrible to work with? That's really what he's asking, let's be honest. So the way it worked for me was I have 3 editors. So the major English language territories, the UK, the US, and Canada, all participated together to create a sort of global book that would resonate in various places. For me, something that was very important was the editing. I was adamant that there's one editor in Canada, Nicole Winstanley, who works at Penguin and is just incredible, that I wanted her on my editorial team. So I made sure that she would have the project exclusively. And if she didn't like it, I think I would have slit the wrist. But fortunately, she took it on and has really been so important to me because I trust her judgment so much. But yeah, there are 3 editors working at all times, and it's challenging to listen. It doesn't matter how much experience you have. It is challenging to really listen deeply to feedback at the same time as knowing that you know more than anyone else about this world and these characters. And there's that subtle line of like, this is good feedback, and this I can't take because it goes against the world. And when you have a really good team, and I'm lucky to have a really amazing team, you find that balance. You're always navigating that balance of what is right within this world. It's a question that constantly gets answered and answered and answered through the editorial process.
Is there an example of something that was revealed to you through the editing process for either book that deepened or opened up a part of the world that even you hadn't seen before?
You know, for me, it was volume setting. Again, that goes back to blindness. When I handed in my draft, I thought, oh my God, they're going to cut all this description. So bloody boring, the hotel. I mean, how many times do I describe it? This place is over-described. I've over-embellished. I've given too much. And they're going to cut it back. Oh, no, they did not. They asked for more. They did exactly the opposite of what I predicted because I was blind going in that labyrinth and I really couldn't see. And in the end, now it's only years later that I can see they were right, that the reader needed more. The reader needed a bit more in order to complete the picture than I was willing to give at the beginning. And so it's those sort of things that together with your team, you figure out the right volume for various aspects of a book.
Other questions? All right, well, I'll ask another question. You know, we're here in Los Angeles.
Thanks for the rain, okay?
Don't thank me, thank my mother. But, and, you know, The Maid has been optioned for film. And I'm just curious if you can share a little bit about that experience and what that's been like for you.
Well, two of my producers are in the room tonight.
Sitting on opposite sides of the room. That's a story in itself. Yeah,
I'll get that story later. So Universal holds option rights for the film. And, you know, we were stymied for a little while because, as you know, in this town, there was a strike. There's strikes going on. There wasn't a lot going on for a while there. But things are back on track. Things are moving it in. And I'm really excited. I'm extremely hopeful that we'll see this come to the big screen sometime soon. For me, the fun part of that is exactly the opposite of that, what I just described about you completing the picture. When we watch a movie, the picture is complete. Every detail of the Regency Grand will be, you know, there for us to enjoy on the screen. And for me, that is going to be such fun.
That's interesting. Yeah. I'm curious, you talked about this book as a voice-driven novel, and obviously you've created this iconic character in Molly who has such a strong voice. Are there books you would recommend to us, maybe books that might be a little bit off, maybe ones that aren't #1 New York Times bestsellers that you feel like really, for those of us who love that very voicey character driving a story, books that you've just loved or learned from in that way?
Well, we were talking earlier about Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine. Did any of you read that? Yeah. So I loved that book. And that was a book that, you know, it's old now. I think it's been 10 years since that was since that was published. But it was an important book to me because the main character is very prickly. And in a way, the author was asking a question like, how do you love a cactus? You know, very carefully. You can't hug it very well. It's going to hurt. And it was a difficult character. It wasn't an immediately likable character. And I learned so much from reading that book about how to slowly entrance the audience to love somebody who isn't maybe immediately likable, you know? And that is a book that moved me greatly and that inspired me to write this book. And I think that writers write on the backs of other writers. We're constantly learning from each other. You know, it's an ecosystem where you learn a lesson from something that you admire and you take that with you in whatever way. And that's certainly a book that moved me greatly.
Great. Well, I can endorse too. Terrific book. Definitely worth checking out. Do we have any last questions before we get all of these books signed by Nita?
Well, since you are an editor and have read so much, did you find when you were writing that it was difficult not to remember a device, a passage, a character, and use that these days with plagiarism being all over the news and so on? Did you stumble across things or?
You know, in a way, all work, as I said, is a reconstruction of something that somebody else has done before. You know, there's a scene in The Maid in my first book, which is really Shakespeare. It's a maid, and it's Desdemona. You know, it's two people. You know, one dressing the other, one putting makeup on the other, and there's a scene there that is incredibly similar, if you think about it, to another scene written many, many years ago and better. But I think that's again, you have an ode to something you love, and then you try and do something different, and that's the magic combination.
Yeah.
You know,
They say great art rhymes, right? There are
Exactly.
these connections in that way.
It always has to be original, and I think that's true with genre too. You know, it's the mystery genre, as you know, is incredibly difficult because there are so many masters of it. We've all read really great mysteries and really great thrillers. So the question you're asking yourself when you enter that realm is, oh my God, what the heck can I do differently? How can I add and innovate to the genre? You know, how can I do something original that isn't exactly what's been done before? And that becomes the challenge of writing.
I have a question. I've been trying to figure out what exactly I'm trying to ask. But there's something about Molly's experience in life and pain that you sort of allude to. But it's just alluding. It's not so. In the second book, maybe a little bit more describes what she's gone through because of her difference. How did you balance? I mean, so it was apparent to me much more in the second book and the first book what she dealt with in her life. How did you think about how to portray that? Because it's character development, right? I mean, she went through a lot, and yet there was the nuances about her experience. And I'm just so curious how you made decisions like that to keep her alive in that way.
I don't know. I sit behind her eyes. The same thing that I ask you to do as a reader, I've done myself. I sit in it. I steep in it. You know, I sit in her pain. I understand it. And I know she doesn't want to dwell on it. Right? Who wants to dwell in pain? No, most people want to get through it. They want to move forward. And sometimes the pain will weigh them down. And we'll have a moment like Molly does where it has a gravity and she has to revisit it. But it's that past and present. Move to the past, discover what it is that hurts, supersede it, move forward, go to the next scene, conquer. Oh, no, it's still the past. So there's a rhythm there about how she moves through life that I hope has some emotional verisimilitude to how we move through life. You know, you can't get over a trauma of any kind, whether it's grief or something else, instantly. It doesn't work that way. We have to move forward in the present, and sometimes we drift backwards because there's something we have to learn there to take with us and move forward again. So it was that rhythm that is a narrative rhythm, but I also think it's an emotional rhythm that we have as human beings that I was trying to build in a wave-like way through the book. There's probably more, but that's all I know.
No, that's
Well, and maybe I'll ask one last question, and then we'll have signing and an opportunity to talk with you more individually. You know, building on that, I think there is such a deep emotional connection that readers have formed with Molly, and people who really feel seen in that character, whether in pain or whether in triumph. And I guess I'm just curious, what do you hope for readers of The Mystery Guest and people who feel that connection with Molly? What are you hoping when they, get to the last page of this book that they're experiencing?
Hope. I hope you experience hope because you can see the character grow, and she has so many difficulties in a lot of ways, and yet she gets over them. She moves forward.
Yeah.
And that's one of her defining characteristics is that she can move forward while moving backwards at the same time. And I hope that for myself, and I hope it for all of you.
Thank you so much. What a great question. Thank you. Well, I hope you'll all pick up a book, which you can buy them over there and get them signed over here. And Thank you so much, Nita,
Thank
for coming and
you.
being part of this. And thank you, everybody, for coming out this evening.
Thank you. Oh my goodness, you're
Oh, that
so
was
good.
great.
Thank you so
Oh,
much.
Absolutely.
Fantastic
What a
question.
pleasure.